I think that's part of why I love traveling by bicycle so much is there were so many times where I would be stopped on the side of the road looking at something and cars would be going past at 60 miles an hour, probably wondering what the crazy bike guy is looking at. But when you watch the world roll by at 10 miles an hour, you have so much time to appreciate the beauty in what would otherwise seem so mundane.
Welcome to the Seek Travel Ride podcast, where we share the stories and experiences of people who have undertaken amazing adventures by bike. Whether it's crossing state borders, mountain ranges, countries or continents, we want to share that spirit of adventuring on two wheels with our listeners. Hello, I'm your host Bella Malloy and I'm excited to introduce our guest for today's Seek Travel Ride podcast, Jason Allen. In 2019, Jason packed his bike with touring equipment and set off from his home in Wisconsin with a mission to see the beautiful natural landscapes on offer in the U.S.A. Over the course of the next 7 months, he would cross 10 states, ride over 8,500 kilometres and visit countless national parks and state forests, not to mention celebrate his 21st birthday. I'm really looking forward to exploring more about Jason's adventurous bicycle tour today. Jason, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for that very thoughtful introduction and for the opportunity to share my story today.
Oh, Jason, I am really excited to learn more because 10 states, 8,500 kilometres, so many national parks, but so many stories that we are going to learn about. I just cannot wait. But as you know, if you're a listener to the show, I always open with the same question, and that is, can you remember the very first bicycle you ever rode?
I'm not sure that it's the very first bike I ever rode, but I do have a very clear first memory of learning to ride the bike. Like every bike of my childhood, as the younger of two brothers, it was a hand-me-down. And about the only other thing I remember about the bike itself is that it had training wheels. And so one day I was out in front of my house, just toddling down the sidewalk, learning to ride the bike with my dad helping me. And he had been like holding onto my shoulder or maybe the back of the seat, just an extra hand to keep me steady. And we were getting to the point where he thought, "You ready for me to let go?" And I kind of agreed with him. And so we decided to give it a try. And he assured me, he'd keep walking behind me, ready to grab me if anything happened. And sure enough, I lost control of the bike and he did not grab me. I ended up crashing into a tree.
Oh no.
Yeah, right? Thankfully, it wasn't a head-on collision, just like a glancing blow.
Did you bounce?
Oh, I was fine. A little shaken up, but broke one of the training wheels off the bike. And so my dad took a look at it and couldn't really fix it. And he decided, well, let's just try taking the other one off. See how it goes, right? I was a little bit hesitant, but a father's confidence does wonders for a little boy. And so I gave it a try. And I honestly don't remember how it went from there. So couldn't have been that bad, right?
Yeah. So do you remember then, were bikes part of your childhood? Did you ride bikes throughout your childhood and even into your teenage years?
So from what I remember from my childhood, it was mostly just like riding down the block to a friend's house or whatever. And then in my early teens, my parents started getting divorced. The bike became sort of a coping mechanism for me just to get out of the house during their fights. And so that's when I really started to get into biking.
So sort of like an escape machine in a way, escape to places that were just more pleasant for you to be in and like just to get away from it.
For sure. Yeah. It was pretty much my therapy at that time.
It's not a bad therapy to have, but you've taken that on now. And as I mentioned in the introduction, you celebrated your 21st birthday in amongst this tour that you took. So you set off on this amazing bicycle tour. And I can only imagine through the course of the show, we're going to learn about some events that will most likely be, lifelong memories. At such a young age, what inspired you to actually decide to take off?
So when I was 13 years old. I read online about somebody who did a 1.5 year long bike camping trip from like northern Alaska to the southern tip of South America. And I liked biking and camping. And so I became a little bit obsessed with this idea. And so the summer when I was 16, I finally felt ready to give it a try. And so I just did like a quick little overnight trip to a campground, half a day's ride from my home, and spent one night there and biked home the next day. And I liked it well enough that over the next couple of years, I just kept building up, more and more ambitious trips. And yeah, eventually ended it with that 7-month trip.
Jason, then going on these trips and overnighting and camping was something that you did from, you said, 16. So not just riding bikes, but camping. Has being out in the outdoors been something that's always been part of your life that way?
Absolutely. From the trips that my parents would take me on as a very young child. And then I was also a Boy Scout through all of my teen years. Not a very good one. I was just in it for the campouts, but I did do a lot of camping with them. So it has very much been a constant throughout my life.
Just also thinking, like, personally, I love being in the outdoors, and I love that sort of raw experience that you get from camping as well. Like, you hear all the sounds. I must say, from the insides of my tents, my imagination has the most amazing ability to convince me what those sounds I've never heard before are. I'm sure you had some of those moments as well, no doubt.
There were definitely a few such moments, especially with all of the wild camping that I did, far away, no other campers running generators or things like that. It was always a highlight of the night to fall asleep to like the yips and howls of a distant pack of coyotes or 2 owls on either end of my tent hooting back and forth.
Did you ever hoot back at them?
I can't say I did.
That's a missed opportunity. Next visit, next trip.
Right.
So you took inspiration then from seeing about another traveller going from the very top of North America to the very tip of South America. I mean, that is a monumental tour. But what you set out often did, crossing the country from east to west, it's monumental in its own right. Did you, when you first set off, envision going as far as you did?
To be honest, I wasn't totally sure what the plan was. The plan was more or less to ride from my home in like north central U.S. out to the north end of the West Coast and then down the West Coast of America. And I figured Southern California was far enough away that I would have time to figure out where I'm going once it got a little bit closer.
Oh, for sure. And lots of time pedaling on the road to work things out along the way too.
Right. Yeah. A lot of time for thinking on the bike.
Absolutely. So the bike that you took and the setup that you had, did you take a lot of time figuring out what you would take with you and how you would prep the bike for travel?
That was a lot about what those earlier, smaller trips were about. Yeah. I actually started off borrowing my mom's old commuter bike because the road bike I had didn't have a rack for carrying camping gear. And on my first tour, I just took whatever old tent I could find in our garage and off I went. And then, so that first tour was not exactly comfortable, but it taught me a lot about, which gear to prioritize. And so over several years, first the new bike and then slowly built up my kit.
What sort of bike did you land on? Like, what have you got now? What is your touring setup?
So it's a Trek 520, their touring bike. That's what they market it as. And living in Wisconsin, Treks are manufactured like an hour down the road from here. So it was kind of the obvious choice. And so, yeah, I bought that ahead of my second tour and it's still running strong today.
Fantastic. And your setup for such a long journey, were you sort of like 2 panniers on a rear rack, and did you have panniers or fork bags on the front as well?
I did have panniers on the front. On some of my earlier tours, I just used the rear bags, but for the longer tour with, through some more remote areas, I decided extra storage for more food and then the handlebar bag as well, for quick access to sunglasses and maps while I'm on the road.
A tour of that length, it definitely gives you the ability to sort of learn how to pack so much better. Like you become packing ninja might be an interesting way of putting it, because I've certainly ended up at campsites going, which pannier did I put that bit of cooking equipment in? But did you have like a set routine each day for like, setting up your tent, get what pannier things, where things belong? Did you have a flow to your day from that point of view?
I think I got a pretty good system figured out after the first couple weeks. By the end of the tour, I think I could tell you which pannier any item was in, but where in that bag was anyone's guess. Complete chaos in there, but it worked for me.
Yeah, it's like a complete pannier explosion to find something that's like in the far depth right corner of the bottom of the pannier to find stuff.
Right?
Oh, yeah. I think every touring cyclist can relate to this. Maybe there's some that can't, and if you can't, get in touch and tell me what your trick is. I haven't figured it out yet. So, in terms of planning the route, you told me minimum planning leads to maximum adventure. I absolutely love that. I nearly feel like I should have it in bold somewhere in my house to just see. Was that the ethos that you had, or is that something that you would reflect on now to describe your planning for this type of trip?
I think it was a little bit of both. A friend actually came up with that before I even left. And so it was kind of in the back of my mind when I set off, but I don't think I realized just how true it was until I look back in hindsight. I think that mentality is somewhat of a prerequisite for the way we choose to travel, where the difference between a headwind or a tailwind could make for a 30 kilometers or an 80-kilometer day. But a part of it was also like trying to make it my first instinct to say yes to any opportunities that come up. Like, if a neighboring camper invites me over for a morning cup of tea and we end up really hitting it off and talking until noon, then I don't want to miss that opportunity just for the sake of putting in a few more miles.
I love that mindset for travel. Like, you're all about maximizing your experience and interactions and connections and moments. That's brilliant. I absolutely love that. So, whilst not planning down into the details is one thing, you set off your first sort of destination, for lack of a better word. That was a national park, wasn't it?
It was, kind of. The first major milestone that came up was Badlands National Park in South Dakota. And Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota ended up kind of being a stop along the way. But yeah, I had seen the Badlands briefly before on road trips out west, but always just passing through, never really spending time there. And I am so glad I took the time to camp there for a couple of days. It is such a unique ecosystem and just a really cool place.
Is it not just a place where the scenery is quite unique, but is the wildlife unique in that part of the US as well?
There's a whole lot of nothing out there, honestly. And for the longest time, I didn't see much wildlife. Going into some of the more remote parts of the park, there's like one half of it with paved roads and the visitor centers and all that, and then the other half is like a gravel road. And maybe a mile past the transition to gravel road, I ran into a herd of bison that were maybe a little too close to the road for comfort with a bicycle, but that was like the first really memorable wildlife encounter, I think.
It's amazing. As soon as you get off the beaten path, off that pavement, magic happens on the gravel.
Yeah, right?
Did that experience inform any of your choices then from a road point of view? Like, did you try to maximize adventure by taking that cliche saying, going off the beaten path?
I think so, yeah. I'm trying to think of another example of it. In Washington State, going through the North Cascades, which North Cascades National Park doesn't exactly sound like the beaten path or off the beaten path, but when it's one of the least visited of all the national parks, it's definitely the road less traveled, and that ended up being a highlight of the entire trip. So I'm really thankful that I decided to kind of get away from the people for that section.
Speaking of people then, you were talking earlier about you were welcome to have those human interactions and, talk with a fellow traveller at a campsite for hours if that was an opportunity that afforded itself. Did you find, on balance, were there many days where you were truly on your own?
It was not uncommon for me to forget the last time I heard my own voice, just because there was nobody to talk to. And As much as I loved meeting the people along the way, I also really enjoyed those moments of solitude. There's just something about just being out there and having these incredible experiences and just having them to yourself. I don't know. It's really hard to describe, but I loved it.
It sounds like it was invigorating for you.
I think that's a good word for it. Yeah.
And so you would go potentially stretches of a few days at a time. Like you might see cars or someone going the other way, but you'd be out on your own in a wild camp day after day.
3 or 4 days was about my limit. Yeah, that was just because that's how much food I could pack in my panniers. But yeah, that was not uncommon at all.
Actually, speaking of packing panniers and, long trips away from restock, did you ever get curious enough to weigh what your bike was fully loaded?
So with food for about 3 or 4 days, but without water, it weighed in about 80 pounds or 36 kilograms of bike and camping gear. It was, maybe I was regretting packing a couple of those luxury items as I was pedaling that over the Rocky Mountains, but
I suppose your tour was long enough that maybe the answer to this question is no, I used everything. But did you manage to get through the whole tour and take things that you realise, I don't need to have this with me? Like, did you post anything away or leave anything behind? Or did you get to the end of your tour and go, I used everything?
I think the only thing I mailed home might have been a couple of books that I picked up along the way. I would, buy a book in a national park visitor center and read it, and then it would sit in my bag for weeks, and I'd collect another one, and eventually I mailed home a package of like 2 or 3 of them. But everything else ended up getting put to use as far as I can remember.
I could imagine like books would be comforting and getting to camp each night, having something to read if you're a reader as well. But yeah, they would then become a significant dead weight as you're pedaling along, right?
Eventually I picked up a Kindle, and I think that's the way to go in the future, but
For sure. I always think the one thing I regret not packing on my own cycle tours is an extra easy gear on my bike. So you can never regret having an easier gear to spin in. Let's put it that way.
Well, I feel better hearing that from someone who lives in the mountains.
Trust me. Maybe it's because I live in the mountains. They bite my behind many, many times. Don't you worry. They have a way of letting you know what your form is for the day. Doesn't matter how much I might feel like I'm struggling. They're always a good reason to stop and just take in the scenery too.
Yes, that's true.
Jason, minimum planning, maximum adventure. I love the idea that you didn't have a set necessary, I don't want to do a daily distance that I have to meet or a daily target each day. You were free to stop where you wanted within the parameters of finding somewhere safe to camp each night. But did you find there were many occasions where you just discovered a place you'd never knew existed before and just wanted to spend extra time there?
Absolutely. Heading east of San Diego, California, through the Anza Borrego Desert State Park, absolutely gorgeous. I did not expect to fall in love with the desert as much as I did. So that was definitely an area that I kind of slowed down and took a little bit more time.
Is there something that struck you so much about that landscape that just blew your mind?
I don't know. It's really hard to describe the effect that it had on me. It was just the mountains for one thing, or, well, mountains off in the distance. There were these beautiful kind of cliffs and hills. And I don't know, I just also really admired like just how much life there was in the desert. We always think of them as like these barren, empty lands. But once you're actually traveling across them, you realize there's so much plant life and beautiful flowers. And
you know what that reminds me of? I had the pleasure of interviewing one of my guests for the show, Dr. Florence Cattell, and her bicycle tour entailed cycling from the top of Australia in Darwin all the way down to Adelaide. And as an Australian, I can attest that many Australians would think there's nothing in the middle of Australia. It's just a vast, empty landscape. It's a desert. And I remember mentioning this to Florence, and she encountered this a lot from people. Why are you travelling that way? Because it's empty. But she recalls the same experience as you, Jason, in that there's so much out there. It's amazing, and it's its own habitat in itself.
I think that's part of why I love traveling by bicycle so much, is there were so many times where I would be stopped on the side of the road looking at something and cars would be going past at 60 miles an hour, probably wondering what the crazy bike guy is looking at. But when you watch the world roll by at 10 miles an hour, you have so much time to appreciate the beauty in what would otherwise seem so mundane.
To me, you're totally immersed in a sensory activity as well, because you don't just visually see the landscape, but you also hear the landscape. Sometimes you smell the landscape. It's sometimes the forager in me certainly has picked food growing wild from the landscape, and you taste the landscape. And they're all opportunities, like you say, you can take with this form of slow travel.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have any opportunities of picking wild food on your ride at all?
I can't say I remember doing that personally, but I seem to recall when I was in Montana during mulberry season, some sort of wild berries were in season while I was there. And so quite a few Warm Showers hosts sent me off with a bag of berries or would share something they baked with them. Oh, so good.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Eating stuff fresh in season is the best. With your Warm Showers hosts, how often did you find you were staying in Warm Showers?
So Warm Showers started for me in Montana. I was there in early September, which is definitely on the tail end of the season, and we got a couple big snowstorms while I was there. So I kind of turned to Warm Showers out of necessity when it was too cold for camping, and I ended up spending half of my nights in Montana with them. And then I just loved the community so much that even once I got to the warmer weather of Southern California, I still regularly found myself using it, just to meet good people. So all that to say, I still spent the majority of my nights in the tent, but there were definitely, I would say, 1 or 2 nights a week on average for that second part of my trip where I was in someone's home.
And it's sort of in contrast, in a way, your trip gave you the best of both worlds. You had those days of solitary, alone with your own thoughts for days on end, which were uplifting for you, but also those moments shared with, I guess, people with a common interest in bicycle travel and touring. So you had those experiences as well throughout your trip. So it's from one side of the pole to the polar opposite other spectrum.
It's I spent a lot of time on my own on that trip, but I found that any time I needed a human companion, it wasn't hard to find. Whether it's a Warm Showers host or a neighboring camper or a hostel roommate in some of the larger cities. Yeah, there were always lots of people around.
Did you come across a lot of cycle tourists as well?
I did. The first ones were in Wyoming. Passing through some small town late in the afternoon, a local stopped to chat, said his church opens their doors to other cyclists if I needed a place to sleep. And so I took him up on it. And then these 2 friends, Allie and Alex, showed up. They had flown from England to Washington, D.C. and were biking to Vancouver, Canada. And so we talked late into the evening, sharing stories of our travels. And the next day was rainy, so we took a rest day. And then the day after that, we rode together for a day over my first big mountain pass. So it was nice, good day for, some friends. And then later on, especially in Southern California and into Arizona, there was a stretch where I was running into other cyclists once a day for a week or 2.
And again, those opportunities of it's that shared experience and that shared empathy that comes with traveling in the way of this nature as well. So you have an understanding of the efforts it's taken to get there, but you also are in that same mindset of travel. So you have that in common.
I always cherished my time in the company of car campers, but I always struggled to explain to them why. Why do we choose to watch endless cornfields crawl by at, such slow speeds on a bike? But when you're with other bicycle tourists, you don't have to explain that. They just get it.
It's also, what motivates us to keep going when we've had, a week of bad weather in the row, because the prize that's around the corner at the end of that week, don't you?
Yup.
So endless cornfields. Was that a landscape you came across quite often in the US?
Just at the start of the trip, here at home in Wisconsin and into Minnesota. In eastern South Dakota, it just turned to grazing pasture, just grass as far as the eye could see. But past the Badlands is when it really started to get more exciting. But yeah, to start the trip off like that was a little bit demoralizing.
Yeah, and I guess on a long trip, maybe you had the benefit of seeing the corn crop transition into colours. During the pandemic for myself, when I was in Dublin, I was in North County Dublin, and so I had a lot of cycling in a very small location, but it was very flat, and all it was wheat or rye or barley crops. And I remember over the course of a few months riding the same roads, going mental. But I remember always passing a field and just being curious to see how, from one day to the next or a week to the next, how different the corn had progressed. It was quite interesting.
It's interesting that you started that thought off by mentioning like the change of colors, because I remember in South Dakota, there was this one particularly difficult day where I was just grinding through agriculture land, and suddenly I looked up and I realized that off to the whole right side of the road was just this bright yellow. It was a sunflower field as far as the eye could see in 3 directions. It was just like, wow, that was such a cool moment, just that little thing that helped get me through a rough day.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like, sunflowers for me just make me happy. And people who know me well know that Bella has this weird quirk where I don't like the colour yellow. There's a reason, but we won't go into it. But I love the colour yellow in nature and in flowers, and I love sunflowers. I find them so uplifting.
Uplifting was definitely what I felt when I saw those that day, yeah.
And what you needed too. Nature is providing.
Yup.
So, Badlands National Park, that was the first sort of prominent national park that you visited. What were some of the others along the way?
So after that, my next major goal was Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Park on the far side of Wyoming. And I had actually been on a car camping trip with my parents out that way when I was maybe 9 years old. And I was kind of undecided on revisiting them. But I ended up doing it, and I am so glad I did, because I did not fully appreciate it at such a young age. And then from there, it was North Cascades in Washington State, and then Olympic Peninsula, which was very rainy, but I'd like to go back during the right time of year. And then Joshua Tree National Park was the last one, which was also just spectacular.
Notwithstanding the sights you're seeing along the way to get to these places, Jason, when you would arrive at a national park, did you, minimum planning, maximum adventure, did you allow yourself multiple days in an area? Did you have time off the bike to explore in other ways?
As much as possible, yeah. The national parks, especially some of the more remote ones, there wasn't always the logistical support that bike tourists need in the form of like food, grocery stores. And like the campground in Joshua Tree didn't have any running water. You had to bring in all of your water, which is not easy to do on a bicycle. So I only ended up getting like 2 days camping in Joshua Tree because of that, but I would spend as much time as I could in each park.
Yeah, and take in some hikes and...
Yup, good to stretch the legs out a little bit.
Yeah, but it's also, and I've said this before as well, I often find that where the road ends, sometimes that's where the real adventures begin. Certainly where I live in the Pyrenees, the tarmac and the roads take you to some amazing places in the mountain, but then the roads turn to hiking trails, which are single tracks, and sometimes literally are trails made by cows or sheep or horses that graze up high. That's where the adventure really begins. And I've not visited the US, but in my mind, I picture, knowing what I know about national parks, that there would be a similarity in that the hiking trails take you further and deeper than the roads which give you access to the parks in the first place.
Absolutely. Some of the highlights of that whole trip were not on the bicycle, but out on foot, exploring those hiking trails.
When you got to these national parks, were they a more popular spot along the way with other travellers? Like, were your moments of solitary, or on your own, your solitude moments rather, were they in these places as well, or were they sort of the in-between moments?
North Cascades National Park was a lot of solitude there, but all the rest of them were very popular, especially Yellowstone, because I got there in like mid-September. So it was sort of the last hurrah for family vacations before the kids go back to school. And which, I always appreciated, the opportunity to meet some interesting people there. So it was good to have people there, I think.
I'm just thinking now also, Jason, just the nature of your trip is you started in August.
That's right. Yep.
And so then traveling the way that you did, no doubt that means you would have traveled through autumn or fall, as you call it there in the US. You would have seen some amazing change of colors in the scenery, no doubt.
Oh, for sure. Grand Teton National Park. I remember one hike in particular that I did. It was just so many beautiful colors. And then actually in Montana during the snowstorm, it was just beautiful because the leaves were at their peak color, but still on the trees. So you had these beautiful orange and red contrasting against the white snow on the ground. It was incredible.
And then there's always that moment as well with first snowfalls where it just feels like everything's quiet. And maybe you experience that like in your wild camp as well, where there's just silence and it's just hushed, and the noise of the world of our day-to-day lives doesn't exist anymore for a little magic point in time.
I actually had one night in Montana where I was wild camping in the middle of nowhere. And yeah, I laid down in bed, turned out my light, and realized it was dead silent out. And once you get used to falling asleep to like the constant chirping of thousands of crickets, that was a little bit unnerving, honestly.
You needed some background white noise.
Yeah, right?
Would that mean that no noise at all? Would that have freaked you out more than a noise that you'd hear in your tent that you didn't know what made that noise?
Absolutely. It kind of felt like the whole forest was hiding from something, or like it was just so unnerving.
I could imagine every time you'd roll over in your sleeping bag and just rustle, that would just sound so loud. There's no hiding.
When you're camping, it's not uncommon to hear like random twigs snapping or something, and normally that just gets lost in all the other background noise, but when it's silent and then you hear that, echoes like a gunshot.
Can you remember, was there a like bird song in the morning?
There was. I remember feeling relief to hear that, actually.
You probably woke up earlier and got going earlier that day. I find myself that's something that happens when you camp, is that you kind of sort of almost go to bed with the sun and wake up with the sun to some degree as well. Did you find that for yourself too?
I remember one day passing through some small town. I stopped at a grocery store, and as I was packing the food onto the bike, a local passerby, asked about the bike with all the stuff on it. And when I told him what I was up to, he said, "You're the most free man in the world." And a couple months later, I was still traveling when daylight savings time came around, and it took me a couple of days before I noticed that the time on my watch and my phone were different. So yeah, that really made me stop and appreciate that I wasn't just a slave to the clock and the calendar. I didn't care what time of day it was. I usually didn't even know what day of the week it was.
Yeah, your routines weren't set from that normal day-to-day routine that you'd have in a different environment in a working time at all. Like you were in long travel holiday mode in some degree.
Which, that's not to say there isn't some routine in that too, but it's very different for sure.
Hello everyone, it's Bella here from the show. I just wanted to quickly ask you all a real big favour. If you really enjoy listening to the Seek Travel Ride podcast, could I ask you right now to go into your podcast playing app and take the time to leave us a rating and review? The reason it's important is this is the way our show gets pushed out to a wider audience and discovered. So I'd really appreciate it if you could do that. Or alternatively, how about you just talk about the podcast with your friends and family, share it on your social media. Thanks so much. Now back to the show. So with your routine, were there sort of like daily type of rituals, for lack of a better word, that you would get into there?
I would say the one main thing was that I brought a paper journal along with me and ended up writing in that several times each day. So anytime I came into a town and saw a park with a picnic table, I would sit down and just write a few notes about the day. And I found that I don't even go back and read the journals all that often, but just the process of like sitting down and really taking time to thoughtfully process the day's events really helped to kind of cement in my memory a lot of those smaller moments that would be easy to forget.
I love that you took the time to write your experience down in that, like you said, in that day, in that moment, so that they don't get lost in the blur. And putting aside whether you go back and read them at all, like they're there for you if you need to recount and reflect on them. That is cool. I love that. Can you recall your best wild camping spot?
Yes. It was in Sedona, Arizona on the tail end of the trip. Like, trip pretty much ended in Sedona. And for anyone who's not familiar, Sedona is just this gorgeous town surrounded by these like big red rock cliffs in the desert of Arizona. And my very first night in the town, I went up this road going out of town, and it pretty quickly turned to like rough rock, like four-wheeler type of road. And I just kept going maybe a mile or two out of town and found this absolutely gorgeous place to pitch my tent. The rocks, like the cliffs across the valley, were exposed to the setting sun, so they were glowing this beautiful, in the fading light. And I ended up spending 2 weeks in Sedona, and I went back to that spot quite a lot.
Again, I've used the word uplifting a few times talking with you already, Jason, but I imagine this was a really uplifting place to be in for you.
It really was. And I actually went back there on the very last night of the trip before the coronavirus put an end to it. And I can't think of a better place to have spent my last night in the tent.
You've taken this trip that's taken you to some amazing natural landscapes, and you're travelling through changing landscapes all the time. But that's not to say that you were in the countryside and in nature throughout your trip. You also visited some significant cities along the way too.
I did. The first one was, Minneapolis and St. Paul, and then after that, it was Seattle. I really enjoyed my time in Seattle, Washington. I ended up staying in a hostel there for a few nights and exploring the town on foot during the day, and then working my way down the West Coast. Stayed with some family friends in Los Angeles, and then I really enjoyed my time in San Diego, California as well.
Did you find it took any time transitioning from being out in the open to being back in the city lights?
Yeah, it was definitely a bit of a transition sometimes. Usually by the end of my stay in the cities, it was easy to get back out into nature. But getting into like the hustle and bustle of the cities was definitely a bit strange, especially for the first one or two.
And I guess also the practical point of view of cycling in towards the city and the infrastructure that's available for you to do that. Was there a vulnerability at all that you felt traveling on a bike into cities there?
Some were better than others, but Los Angeles definitely left me feeling vulnerable. That was a pretty stressful day's ride.
And it's also, I mean, when you're touring, you're going at slower speeds in general anyway, but I often find like it's just traveling through a city is just everything is slowed down immensely because of, red lights and traffic, and there's those navigational frustrations potentially as well to throw into the mix.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting that you describe the cities as so much slower, and like, yes, they are make for slower riding, but it kind of feels like so chaotic.
Absolutely. I can. Your speed is slower, but everything is rushing towards you, and you're rushing towards it in some way as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, definitely. And there's a level of defensive riding that kicks in as well. Like you just expect no one's going to see you, so you have to see them first and react.
Yup. When you go from like days where you can count the number of cars you see on your hands to just sudden overloaded with traffic, and yeah. It was definitely had to ride more defensively, and, it wasn't quite as relaxing.
Oh, I could imagine. So I guess on the topic of navigation, Jason, and again, minimum planning, maximum adventure, how did you navigate for this tour?
So as far as like the day-to-day actual riding, a lot of it, at least to start, was Google Maps, which I very much have a love-hate relationship with. And so after a couple of weeks, I felt that I developed a better sense than the app did as to like what roads I wanted. And so I would mostly just look at Google Maps like you would a paper map and just kind of make it up as I went. And of course, if I met any other bicycle tourists going in the opposite direction, always take their advice.
I also have a thought in my mind that no cycle tour is complete without I guess, route planning or mapping failure to some degree. Or failure is not the right word. It's a route incident. The ones that are better off remembered with rose-tinted glasses and hindsight, but in the moment put you into a bit of a struggle. What's one that comes to mind for you?
In Montana, there was this one day, I was heading towards the town of Missoula, and I had actually made arrangements to stay with a warm showers host there, and Google Maps ended up putting me on this road, sort of going over a small mountain between two bigger roads, and I got onto this road, and there was a sign to the effect of, "This road is impassable when wet, high clearance, four-wheel drive vehicle strongly recommended." And this was also right after, like the day after the snowstorm. So the snow was melting and everything was wet. And I decided to go for it anyways, thinking maybe there are a few small sections where I need to hike a bike. It ended up being like a 10-mile hike up steep mud roads. I would take the panniers off the bike and hike 2 panniers up and go back and get 2 more and then the bike, and on it went. And finally I got to the warm showers host at like 9:30 that night. And thankfully this host was like a local legend. He gets like thousands of cyclists he's hosted over the years. And so I'm proud to say that in all the thousands of cyclists he's hosted, he said my bike was the muddiest he had ever seen. So he completely understood that, like, that night, shower, bed, we'll talk in the morning. And then he let me take a rest day to just wash my bike the next day and do some laundry.
Oh my gosh, when you were just telling me that story and you said 10 miles, so, that's like 16 kilometers.
Yup.
That's a big hike on its own, yet alone without panniers, on, off, bike, hiking. Oh my goodness me. Were you questioning life choices throughout that day?
There were definitely some moments where I thought, questioned why I ever thought biking across a continent would be a good idea. Yeah.
But these are the powerful stories that we get to tell now, Jason. And I could just imagine the warm showers host. I was nearly wondering, did you like say, "Stand there, I'm going to hose you down before you come inside"?
Right.
Oh, wow.
But you know what? If you follow even the worst gravel, dirt, and yes, mud roads, you follow them far enough and eventually they take you back to pavement, right? So just got to put your head down and push through it.
Yeah, but I can imagine that there would have been some of those gravel roads that would have just led you to the most magic of places too. Like, you take the good with the bad. Has it left you with like a nervous twitch whenever you come across gravel that's a bit wet?
Maybe just a little bit.
Very good, very good. So we mentioned there that you were, you'd obviously travelled through the fall or the autumn on this tour, and you hit some pretty cold, bad weather in wintertime, Jason, and that sort of changed your trip up a little bit in terms of your wild camping?
I definitely became a lot more dependent on like warm showers hosts and hostels and things like that as the trip went on. But honestly, I actually really enjoy camping in cooler weather. There's just something about camping right around freezing temperatures, huddling up in that sleeping bag, getting all nice and warm for the night. And so I did actually enjoy those moments in a weird way,
Waking up to your tent covered in icy frost.
Yup.
Did you have the benefit of having a campfire for any of those nights?
I didn't usually do campfires, but I did bring a stove with me. So in the morning when you're all hunkered down in your warm sleeping bag and it's freezing out, not easy to get yourself moving, but the thought of a hot cup of tea or pot of warm oatmeal definitely helped.
Yeah, it's like that, it's medicine for the soul. I think that first brew that you have off the camp stove, whether it's tea or coffee or if it's food even, it's just that it warms you up from the inside out, doesn't it?
Yup. I'm not much of a coffee person, but take anything warm on mornings like those.
For sure. I think even the birds struggle to get going on those mornings. So you did hit the Pacific and you hit the West Coast. So you travelled all the way across, east to west from where you set off. And then you, despite enjoying solitude, there was a part of you that missed family time and being close with people as well, wasn't there?
Yes. So I got to the Pacific Coast on October 17th, actually. It was 2 months to the day from the start of the trip to when I first saw the Pacific. And so over the next couple weeks, we started getting closer to Thanksgiving. And then there's Christmas and New Year's. But also in my family, my birthday is in early December, and then my mom's is 6 days after mine. So I started thinking a lot about just what it would be like to spend those so many big holidays on my own. And so I decided it was time to head home for just a brief break. And so I ended up spending Thanksgiving at a hostel in Eugene, Oregon, which was just wonderful, really felt like family. And I called my mom on Thanksgiving Day and she asked, "Oh, are you going to be home for your birthday?" And I told her, "Doesn't look like it's going to happen, but I'll be sure I'm home for Christmas." And then she handed the phone off to my brother, and he and I finalized our plans for him to pick me up from the airport 5 days before my birthday. Completely surprised my mom, spent wonderful holidays with the family, saw some old friends for New Year's, and then shortly after it, I was back out to continue my travels.
Wow. It's sort of like, I love, again, the fact that minimum planning, maximum adventure, that you were happy enough to put your trip on pause to go and have those moments with your family as well. And I wonder, Jason, whether 2 months away from home for you yourself just solidified the importance of sharing those special occasions with family and friends?
I think so, yeah. Before I left on this trip, I still lived with my mom and brother, and by day 20, it was the longest I had ever been away from home on my own, and I was just getting started. So I had no idea going into it just what I would be feeling by day 50, 60, 90. So yeah, it was really good to finally get home and see some familiar faces.
What was it like then, having gone back home but then going back to your bike, back over to the West Coast and starting again? Was it like slipping on a familiar, jacket and putting your hands in your own gloves and setting off? Or did it take a while to get into the rhythm?
When I first left on the trip, my mom and I both cried a lot on the driveway in front of the house. But when I went back out after New Year's, it was all smiles. That's not to say they weren't happy tears, but yeah, it was just, I was so excited to get back to it. I felt re-energized and reinvigorated from seeing the family. But yeah, it was time to get away from the Wisconsin winters.
Could imagine. And so then traveling west, because obviously there's places in the west in the US that get pretty cold and bleak in winter as well. But you then headed a bit more south on that west coast too, didn't you, for that second part of your trip?
Yep. So I flew back out to Oregon, picked up the bike from the storage unit I'd left it in, and then it was a bit too cold and rainy in the Pacific Northwest. So I hopped on an Amtrak train to Southern California and started biking from there.
Did you find then, even though it was wintertime, that you were bumping into other bike travelers at that time of year, or were you pretty much on your own from that perspective as well?
So the Pacific Coast Highway is one of the most popular bike touring routes in the U.S., and I did not see many others as I was working my way down the coast. But once I started turning east, through Joshua Tree and into Arizona, that's when I ran into a lot of other cyclists.
And did you have moments like you were mentioning earlier where you've met people on the way and then you shared a day of riding with them? Did that happen at other times in your trip?
It happened here and there, yeah. It seemed like most of them were going east to west, while I was going west to east. So it didn't happen super often, but when I did run into someone heading the same direction as me, their company was always welcome for as long as our paths would follow each other.
And no doubt sharing stories as well. I guess for those going the other way, they may have been able to give you some tips about where your trip could potentially go and what they had experienced as well.
Yeah, I was always appreciative of, logistical advice, roads to be avoided, where to find bike shops, but also just like cool places they've camped and things like that.
Yeah, I could imagine. This is a hard question, so you can take your time answering it. But what would probably be the most unexpected thing that came from your tour?
Oh, that's not a hard question at all. It was the overwhelming kindness of every single person I met along the way. The warm showers hosts who put me up in their home and provided me with, a hot meal and their wonderful company. The drivers who would see me stopped on a desolate road and pull over to offer me an extra bottle of water when I was a million miles from the next town. All those little moments just completely changed the trip for the better, and I did not see it coming at all.
So that unexpected, just human kindness and the kindness of strangers. That is awesome. With that in mind, this is such a big trip, and to try and condense it down into a small show, I always find so hard because I find we can talk about national parks and cities, but I know that there's so many small things that have happened along the way. Was there a particular state that you loved the most, that you wished you could, that you would do a tour through just again?
I really loved the mountains of Montana, but then once I got to Washington State, it completely stole my heart. I grew up in Virginia, like 15 miles from the ocean. I practically learned to swim in big waves of salt water. And then when I was 7 years old, my family moved 1,000 miles away from the nearest salt water. So the ocean will always be my home. And as much as I love the mountains of Montana, there are beautiful mountains in Washington too. Yeah, that was the highlight of the trip for sure.
Actually, speaking of mountains, you had, was it 5 days in a row, Jason, where you crossed 5 mountain passes?
It was. That was a big week in the North Cascades, but it was gorgeous. Especially the last big climb up Washington Pass was only until my recent trip to Alaska. That was pretty much my favorite place on earth. It was beautiful.
Did you find yourself from the first day of tackling those climbs to the last day of tackling those climbs, tired and fatigued from multiple kilometres of mountains in the legs aside, did you find from a mindset point of view you were having a different approach to the effort required?
I think so, yeah. I definitely got better at pacing myself because growing up in the Midwest, we don't have mountains like that here at all. So it was a learning experience for sure. But between the Rocky Mountains in Wyoming and Montana and then into the North Cascades, I definitely learned to appreciate them and even enjoy the struggle of the climb.
What about the thrill of the downhill? Are you a fan of descending mountains?
Oh, for sure. It gets a little bit sketchy on a loaded touring bike sometimes, but it's a nice little reward.
Totally. And you be checking your brake pads.
I brought spares for both front and rear wheel, and I swapped them out right before the second mountain range.
I could imagine, because 8,500 kilometers does take a toll, not just on your body, but your bike's body, your bike's componentry. Could we spend a little time there talking about like mechanicals? Did you have any mechanical disasters aside from punctures, I imagine?
Yes, and it came pretty early in the trip in South Dakota. I got a flat tire first thing one morning, and I was riding along. Bike felt a little bit weird. I put it on the kickstand to see what was wrong, realized it was a flat tire. Okay, get to work. Flip the bike upside down and balance it on the handlebars and the seat. And I start swapping out the tube, and the wind that day was absolutely insane. And it blew the bike over. And the kickstand was mounted right by the rear brake caliper. And so when the bike fell onto the end of the kickstand, it twisted the chainstay and threw the brake caliper far enough out of alignment that the rotor wouldn't rotate. So I hitchhiked 20 miles into the nearest town, got some lunch, collected my thoughts, ended up removing the brake rotor and riding 80 miles, 130 kilometers, or about a day and a half at my pace, to the next bike shop without a rear brake. Thankfully, it was all uphill and against the wind, so I was never going that fast. The Mechanic banged on my bike with a hammer, bent it back with a big crescent wrench, got it good enough, put the rotor back on, and no issues with it for the next 4,000 miles.
I've said it before, I feel like you don't know it necessarily at the time, but sometimes going on a big bicycle tour, it's actually, you've just registered in a course of problem solving. Little did you know.
Yeah.
I love that you had the presence of mind in that situation to like, okay, time out. I'm going to have some food first. I'm not going to tackle this problem hangry. And I'm going to, and then figure out a way of going. But yeah, rear brake. So just riding with one brake, sure. How heavy was your bike again, Jason? 36 kilos?
Yep.
I bet you felt so happy to get to that bike store.
A bit of anxiety that he wouldn't be able to fix it and I'd have to like buy some little beater bike to finish my trip on, but so much relief when we got that wheel spinning right.
Definitely. I mean, even if the brake just rubbed a little bit, you'd forgive it. So your trip sadly came to a bit of a premature end because, this coincided with the pandemic setting itself across the world. What was it like in the lead up to that?
In hindsight, now understanding the scale of the pandemic, it feels a little bit ridiculous to say this, but I was heartbroken to have to end my trip like that. And now I realize, I got out of it so much better than so many others. But yeah, and it happened so fast. I remember like March 10th, I'd seen news about the coronavirus and I was aware of it, not planning to drastically change my plans. And then March 16th, I read an article where an expert on pandemics was speculating that like airports would start shutting down en masse. And I didn't want to be halfway across the country from my family with nothing but a bicycle to get me home if that happened. So the evening of March 16th, I called up my mom, had a long conversation with her, ended up booking the train ticket home that evening. March 17th was the last day on the bicycle. And then March 18th, I was on the train heading back home to a completely different world.
From going day to day, living outdoors, camping outdoors, all warm showers, but, being outside for so many hours to then going back to a shutdown world. We were talking about contrasts earlier. That is a stark contrast.
Yeah, it was for sure an adjustment. It was really weird for a lot of reasons because I had just accomplished something that I had been dreaming of for like 7 years that had really defined the course of like a third of my life. So I'm like, where do I go from here? How do I dream even bigger and then start working towards that? And then to add the pandemic on top of that. And it was a weird headspace for sure.
And it's definitely a thing. I know, and I've come across it myself, and I know many, many other people have as well. Like when you've had this big life goal or an event or a race or whatever you're doing that you are driven for and focused to and you're absorbed in, when that phase comes to an end, it's like the post-tour blues, for lack of a better way of describing it. But it hits hard. But to have to deal with that alongside dealing with the pandemic and how it impacted on, how you live day to day, I could imagine it would be a real troubling thing to have to navigate through.
Yeah.
So your experience there, Jason, and you're a lover of the outdoors. Cycling isn't the only thing that you do. But ticking off this goal that had been in your mind, as you said, for a third of your life, have you done tours since, or is it something that you would do again? Like, have you looked at a map of the world with a bicycle tour in mind?
Honestly, I got a little bit burnt out from it, and travel wasn't really a thing for those couple of years. But yes, I have ideas for other bike tours. Now that I've seen most of the US that I want to, I'm starting to think about going international, and New Zealand is really calling to me. But also recently I've started to realize that I want to branch out and explore other interests rather than hyper focusing on one. So this past summer, I spent a month camping around Alaska with a rental car. And while I was up there, I had the opportunity to try sea kayaking for a day. And then not long after that, I just happened to find this story online about somebody who spent like 70 days kayaking from Vancouver Island up into Alaska. So I think like some big kayak camping trip might be my next really big crazy, scary goal to work towards for a couple of years. And I've already got some plans to get started on that this summer.
Oh, I love it. It's like that thirst for the outdoors and how we experience, but it's that slow travel again. Like slow travel is in your heart and you're looking at different ways. I love that. I vividly remember actually watching a series on TV during lockdown in my apartment in Dublin, and it was of a father and son who canoed down the length of the Yukon River. Wow, that got me wondering about canoeing, I must admit. Not convinced on the bears though. So watch this space for some sea kayaking in your future.
So actually, just the other day, I booked there's like the Door County Sea Kayak Symposium coming up in the summer, and it's up in northern Wisconsin on one of the Great Lakes, and they just do like a long weekend of classes and guided trips. And so I'm going to go do that and learn the basics with someone who knows what they're doing. And then I'm thinking about a month after that, I'm going to try doing a little solo trip for like a week around some islands in the Great Lakes. And we'll see where it goes from there.
Fantastic. Similar to your bike school tour, in fact, Jason, where you had, you started this big trip. The precursor was many little trips to get it all dialed in.
I'm a big advocate of starting small, yeah. I admire the people who just jump head first, zero bike experience, and they tour around the world, but it's not my style.
Power to you. I think what you've done, and like I said at the start, traveling across the entire country, the experiences you've had are so vast. Being on the road for so long, for so many kilometres, you've lived so many moments that, sadly many people are missing in day to day. That's fantastic that at your age you're already filling yourself up with those memories and experiences as well. I hope that with your sea kayaking trips that some of the habits that you formed on this bicycle tour, perhaps, writing down your daily journal will be something that you continue to do. And who knows, maybe our listeners could potentially look forward to a book from you and your adventures in times to come.
Maybe. I haven't ruled that out. Got all those journals that I could flesh out, right?
Yeah, and for our listeners, I've been privileged enough to see some of Jason's photos from his tour as well, and it's just just natural beauty was what you set out to see, and some of the photos there, it's the best of the US on display. So, Jason, I'd love to keep talking with you, but we have to wind this up. I do finish with 2 questions for all of my guests, and that is, first off, if you're faced with the weather challenge of having to ride into a headwind all day, or you could choose to go the other way and cycle up a constant climb, which one are you choosing?
When you set Google Maps to give you cycling directions, it shows you an elevation profile. You know exactly where the summit is, and you can see the downhill that waits you on the other side. The headwinds, some guy might make his best guess as to when it ends, but, it could go on for hours. There's no guarantee of the tailwind. I will take the climb every single time.
I should keep a tally, actually, of my guests who said climbs or wins, but I can tell you now it's significantly, there's a lot more climbers out there. And the last one, if you had a choice of cycling 4 hours on your own or 4 hours with other people, what are you going to be choosing?
I would always plan on it being a solo ride, but if I happen to cross paths with someone and we really hit it off and we're going in the same direction, then their company is always welcome.
I love that. And again, minimum planning, maximum adventure. You set off on this tour, Jason, with the mindset of maximizing experiences and memories. And I love that forms part of your answers now as well. Jason, I have thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you for today's show. Thank you for sharing your awesome story with our listeners. I was going to say, I know you don't have a big social media profile, but if people do want to keep an eye on, what you're up to, is there a way?
Not right now, but it's very likely that I'll end up on Instagram before my next trip. So how about if and when that happens, Bella, I'll shoot you an email and you can add my Instagram handle to the show notes.
It would be an absolute pleasure. I feel like your adventures are ones that many people would benefit being able to see if you're willing to share them with us. So, Jason, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this time.
Oh, thank you. It was absolutely my pleasure.
Wow, what an enjoyable story, and I really feel happy to have had the privilege to bring it to you, our listeners. Now, if you'd like to discuss this story or have any questions about the podcast, then why not join our Reddit community at Seek Travel Ride, a place where all our show's listeners can gather around, talk about the episodes that we've brought to you to date, and even propose some questions to our future guests. You'll find us there on Reddit in the Seek Travel Ride community. Also, if you really enjoy listening to the show, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button to be notified of new episodes. And please, feel free to jump into your podcast player app and give us a rating and review. It really does help because it pushes our show out to a wider audience and helps us grow that community even more. And if ratings and reviews aren't your thing, then just speak to your family and friends and share us on your social media channels. That helps out too. Lastly, if you've got your own epic adventure on a bike story that you'd like to share with our community, then please send me an email at podcast@seektravelride.com and get in touch to find out how you can be interviewed as a guest for future shows. Until the next episode, I'm Bella Malloy. Thanks for listening.